income's gone up that fast.
To penalise and punish the elderly when they have worked all their lives to put into the system and say it's your fault, whingy, whiny, we're going to be envious.
But no, Linda, we're being punished.
No, well, by the politics, so be the change you want to see in the world.
Taxes, I am actually, and I'm about to tell you about the change I want to see in the world.
Are you good? As long as you stop whining about it.
I'm going to stop whining about it, but we are being taken advantage of at the moment to profit, to help the old. Most of taxpayers' money is spent in two departments, the NHS, so the Health Department, and the Department for Work and Pensions. Those departments disproportionately serve the older population. Now, I've got no issue with that, but let's not pretend that it is not young working people that is paying for the public services for old people. So actually, we are having it hard, and I just look at the future, and we see a future of perpetually higher taxes to pay for this increasing ageing population, a shrinking labour force, and you're here saying we've got nothing to worry about.
The young stop voting for mass immigration parties. The young stop voting for parties that don't
point out,
build houses.
Immigrants actually pay taxes, pensioners don't.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Wishing you all a very happy Mothering Sunday. To all those celebrating, a happy Stepmother's Day to my own stepmother. It's been another very busy week in Westminster. The Chancellor's make-or-break budget didn't seem to make anyone happy or indeed break Labour's advance on Downing Street. Theresa May became the 60th MP from the Tories to announce that she's not fighting the next general election. Defeatism or realism? You decide. Former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng will be here in the studio to give us his verdict on his successor's budget. Could this be Hunt's last hurrah? I'll be speaking to Health Secretary Victoria Atkins about what she plans for the £5 extra billion the Treasury has set aside for the NHS. As parts of London were declared a no-go zone for Jews over the weekend, Lord John Mann, the government's anti-Semitism czar, will be weighing in on the Gaza debate. I have an exclusive interview later on in the show with Andrew Rossendale, the Conservative MP for Romford, who has recently returned to Parliament for the first time in almost 2 years after charges were dropped against him following a lengthy investigation by the Met Police. And Stanley Johnson will be here to tell us how he has been following in the footsteps of Marco Polo and giving us his thoughts on the current state of the Tories since they booted out his son. Are they in need of a Bojo comeback? Make yourself a cuppa and settle in for what promises to once again be the mother of all political shows. Right, let's get straight stuck into the Sunday morning papers with my fellow GB News presenter and former Defence Secretary Michael Portillo, who, don't forget, is going to be on straight after my show at 11. Michael, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you for coming in.
You have 3 children. Happy Mothering Sunday to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Now, let's get kick-started. Extremism is a big theme of the Sunday papers. We've got Michael Gove interviewed in the Sunday Telegraph. The quote for that story is, "It's not right my Jewish friends don't feel safe in central London." I think the government is looking to redefine what extremism is. And we've also had this extraordinary scene, Michael, I know you had a look at the video, of this Iranian protester going to the pro-Palestinian march yesterday. OK, he's carrying a poster that others aren't, a poster saying Hamas are terrorists, and then he gets strong-armed by the police.
Yes, of course, the official position of Britain is that Hamas is a terrorist organisation.
Yes.
The government would say that the attack on Israel on October the 7th was a terrorist attack. So that much is clear. So apparently what this man's poster said is, the official position of our country. Of course, the video is not complete. We don't know what happened in between. There's a moment where protesters are trying to take the banner off him. There's another moment where he is strong-armed to the ground by policemen using a good amount of force. I don't know whether it's the right amount of force, but certainly a lot of force. So that's all pretty disturbing. Back to the kind of extremism debate. I mean, this bothers me because one of the reasons that Michael Gove is getting into this is that the previous definition of extremism has actually been counterproductive. So what is happening is that a lot of the government's agencies have reacted to the definition in ways that the government didn't predict. I mean, for example, the anti-terrorist programme has spent a lot of time investigating far-right groups instead of Islamist groups. So a minority of its time is spent investigating Islamist groups. It lists people like Jacob Rees-Mogg. It talks about Brexit as though Brexit were an extremist position. It was actually the majority position of the British people. What worries me is that Gove, instead of trying to sort out government agencies which are behaving in these perverse ways, is seeking to redefine extremism.
Yes.
Now, the next definition of extremism will give us a new set of problems, and some of them might curb free speech. So I think there's going to be a lot of debate about that. What he almost does in the interview is to define Islamism. He doesn't quite get there. Now, I think that would be a very useful definition if we could define Islamism. I mean, he says it's about promoting Sharia law and about promoting an Islamic state. He doesn't explicitly say in Britain, although I assume that's what he means. But let us define things which are simpler than extremism. I have a feeling that he will find again that if he redefines that word, it's going to lead to more counterproductive activity. What he needs to get hold of are the organs of state which are behaving in a perverse way.
Would your instinct be at this stage, I know James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, said, all right, well, you've made your point, to stop these marches from taking place now?
I think certainly to consider how they take place, so possibly to make them static, to review the rules around them. We have this quote from John Mann, who's coming on your programme later. He leads for the government on the question of anti-Semitism. He is clearly very disturbed about the role of the demonstrations. And we're talking about the way these things spread. So, for example, I think John Mann today is talking about the way in which Jewish children in schools are being picked upon by other children and, you know, being described as baby killers and all this sort of thing. And the fear then that you have a sort of segregation where Jewish children are going to feel they can only mix with Jewish children, and possibly, you know, that Muslim children will feel that they can only mix with Muslim children, which in our society is a desperate consideration.
I'll be asking Lord Mann all about that a little later in the show. Let's move on to the other theme of the papers this morning. I'm afraid it's a familiar one. You may be getting a sense of déjà vu, but there's yet more talk about bringing back Boris. Now, the first intriguing story is in the Sunday Times that Johnson flew for secret talks with autocrat Maduro in Venezuela. That is obviously very interesting because he seems to be freelancing on the side, although he did tell the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, that he was going there for these sort of back-channel talks. We've got talk in the Mail on Sunday about a new plot to oust Rishi, and they want Boris to take over. I wrote a piece about the Henley plot yesterday in The Telegraph, which has picked up a little bit of traction, and then a leader column in the Mail on Sunday, which perhaps is the point. I don't know whether you agree with this premise. Boris can help save the Tories, but he doesn't have to be leader. Michael, Boris, help or hindrance?
Well, he's a great election winner. I just have to remind myself he was twice Mayor of London, for heaven's sake, as well as becoming Prime Minister. He won the referendum as well, by the way. He is an enormous election winner. So the great conundrum is, how do you connect this election winner to a party in which he's no longer a part of the parliamentary group? I think he could only campaign for the Tories in the general election with any conviction, any credibility, if he were a candidate at the election. So the point that you were making in your article about the candidate there stepping aside for Boris, I think that is a very interesting one. Whether Rishi is going to be magnanimous enough to allow Boris to do campaigning, I think is a big question. But, I mean, the Tories have to be realistic. It looks very much as though they're going to lose big time. If Boris comes in, it might mean that they lose a little less big time.
And also that makes the prospect of whoever takes over from Rishi Sunak, should the time come, of maybe thinking it might be one Labour term rather than two. And then that makes the prospect of Conservatism in the future a bit more appetising. If it's electoral oblivion, if it's total wipeout, you know, like Tories left sort of completely dangling, facing an existential crisis, and I suppose that's a different set of situations.
I mean, a footnote on Boris. One, he could still be a Member of Parliament if he contested the Uxbridge by-election. Two, if you think he was a bad, disorganised Prime Minister, just wait until you see him as leader of the opposition. Because, at least if you're Prime Minister, you're sustained by the machinery of government. In opposition, it's just freewheeling.
Indeed. Let's also speak about the defence budget. I thought it was interesting that I had Jeremy Hunt in this studio where you're sitting last week, and I sort of asked him about whether he was going to increase defence spending, and he kept on talking about the government being prudent and responsible. We then get the budget on Wednesday. There's no more money for defence. We've got Tom Tugendhat now and Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the former Defence Secretary, calling for that spending to go up. Do you agree with them?
I don't think I do particularly, because I know how I know how badly the Ministry of Defence spends the money.
Right.
I mean, I fear it's pouring good money after bad. By the way, I think the same about the National Health Service.
Yes.
I'm astonished that the Chancellor pours more money into the National Health Service. At some point, we've got to get away from thinking that more money equals, more kit, more soldiers, better productivity or better services in the National Health Service. There's really almost no connection between the amount of money you put into something and what you get out the other end, because, government kind of destroys money somehow. Government loses it along the way.
It loses money, it wastes money, it procures badly.
And so, it is quite puzzling when you and I think everyone in government knows that this is the case. We still talk about give more money, as though that were a virtuous thing. So I'm not at all sure that if I were Chancellor, even if I cared a lot about the defence of the country, which I'm sure Jeremy Hunt does, I'm not sure that I would be convinced that giving them more money was the thing.
Let's have a very quick look now to finalise the paper review with what Michael O'Leary, the Ryanair boss, has been saying to the Sunday Times magazine. He's talking about Brexit. He's described it, and I quote, I shall try and temper this slightly, the dumbest effing idea in history delivered by the dumbest politicians in history, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, are lunatic half-wits. He goes on to say that the over-70s who voted for Brexit will, quote, die out in the next 10 to 15 years, which is a good thing. The younger people will change things. So people watching and listening to this show who might be pensioners who voted for Brexit, it's a good thing that they die, because then Michael O'Leary and his cronies can have more integration with the EU. Your reaction, Michael?
Well, it's a fantastic way to talk about some of your passengers. I was a Ryanair passenger yesterday, actually. I mean, to the point, Brexit was not about the convenience of Ryanair or even about air passengers. It was about the sovereignty of this country. It was about making sure that the decisions that affect our daily lives are taken by people that we can vote for and vote against. And those decisions being made at the level of the European Union, that did not happen. I speak as someone who spends much of my time on the continent of Europe. I have 2 passports. One of them is a European Union passport. I know that the diversity of the political cultures of Europe means that we cannot be governed in common. The ambition of the European Union is that we should be governed in common, and that comes at an enormous expense, which is a lack of accountability. So that was why we left the European Union. It has nothing to do with Ryanair. And I'm afraid that Michael O'Leary, although he absolutely knows how to run an airline, doesn't know very much about accountability in politics.
Indeed so. Thank you very much, Michael. You're now going to quickly scoot off to Paddington so you can present your show from 11 from there. We look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. The People panel is back. Catherine Forster is in Reading. Catherine, I'm intrigued particularly as to what the panel might have made of the budget announcement and what they'd like me to ask my special guest this morning.
Yes, good morning, Camilla, and welcome to the Donata Cafe here in Reading. We've been talking about the budget, we've been talking about the NHS. Of course, the NHS is top of many of our priorities, and the budget will affect all of us. So let's meet our panel now. Charles, I'm going to come to you first. You're retired now, but you worked in the city. What are your questions for our politicians today?
I'd like to ask the Secretary of State for Health, what's she going to do about stopping the exodus of English-trained doctors and nurses to Canada and Australia, where obviously the conditions are better? And for Kwasi Kwarteng, I admire the way he thinks outside the box. Was there some deep state act to get rid of him, and Liz Truss, does he think?
Thank you. Liz Truss certainly seems to think so. John, you are a retired management consultant. You worked with the NHS. What's your question today?
My question is about the NHS, and it goes like this. Given the massive growth in UK population and the state of government finances, what is the Conservative plan over the next parliamentary term to solve the national crisis in adult and children's dental care, the collapse in the provision of GP services, and the NHS rationing of surgery and urgent treatment through NHS waiting lists. What is the plan?
What is the plan? And finally, Nicola, you're a self-employed interviewer in the finance sector. Can we have your question, please, very quickly, if you don't?
So for Victoria Atkins again, I would like to ask why, within a matter of weeks, the UK government will be signing over some of our health sovereignty and autonomy to the World Health Organization in terms of signing the pandemic treaty. Why has there been no open debate about this when 156,000 people have signed a petition calling for a debate in Parliament? If there are benefits, let's hear about them. They should be shouting them from the rooftops. You know, what is there to hide?
Thank you for that. And one comment just a little bit earlier about the budget was, is it sweets today and teeth out tomorrow? Back to you now in the studio, Camilla.
All very good questions from the People panel in Reading. Thank you very much for that, particularly for Victoria Atkins, who is going to be on the show a little later. Now, don't miss the muscles, because, as I say, I'm going to be joined by the Health Secretary. I'm also going to be joined by the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, to find out what he made of his replacement's budget.
I'm Nigel Farage, and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Well, we've been a constitutional monarchy since the late 17th century, and of course part of that deal is that the monarch, or indeed the close immediate royal family, should not interfere with politics that in any way could be seen to affect individual parties. Now, perhaps one of the most classic cases in the 20th century was Edward VIII, who during his brief reign went down to Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, met thousands of people who'd lost their jobs in the steel industry. In fact, he shook so many hands in the end he had to change and shake with his left hand, and he said something must be done to get these people jobs. It was taken as a direct assault on the Conservative government of the day. And we could go on to Edward Heath, as many saw it, using the Queen to get us to join the common market, and things the Queen said during the referendum on Scottish separation. And we could, of course, talk about King Charles, who as Prince of Wales endlessly talked about climate change and net zero. But the intervention overnight from Prince William, I think, is the most direct political piece of interference that has international and global implications that I almost think we've ever seen. Prince William is saying to Israel, stop what you're doing. Some will see that as being given a free pass to Hamas. Many young people will say, hooray, he's doing the right thing. But whether he's doing the right thing or not, has he gone just too far with this? Should our future king intervene in this way? I don't believe that he should. I think he's making a very big mistake.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. I'm delighted to be joined now by former Chancellor of the Exchequer and MP for Spelthorne, Kwasi Kwarteng. Lovely
Hello.
to see you this morning.
Very good to see you. Always good to see you.
Why weren't you in the budget then? Why weren't you watching?
I was watching it from my office.
Right.
And the reason I'm not in the chamber is that people. I don't want to sort of people to pick up my reactions to certain measures.
Fair enough. There was a suggestion you and Liz Truss were running scared.
No. I was scared of what? I don't understand that.
Your own economic principles being sacrificed on the altar of what I thought was a very Labour-light budget.
Well, it was a very centrist and very careful budget.
Yeah, the
but
right
I'm not
budget
sure.
for now?
Well, it's odd that having seen the budget, the polls don't seem to have moved at all.
No.
And I think there's going to have to be something different in the run-up to an election, which is not going to take place in May. I think the idea that, you know, if we're 28, 25 points behind us, according to some polls, that we're going to press the trigger on a general election.
You think that's for the birds?
I don't believe that for a
So
minute.
what do you think? There's going to be another fiscal event before
I don't know.
the election?
I'm not quite sure. It depends all about the timing. Obviously, if it's in May, this will be the last fiscal event and the election will have to be called in 2 weeks. I can't see that happening.
I mean, it's a fiscal fizzle-out, isn't it? We were waiting. I mean, I don't know if you, like me, were sort of watching, and he said, OK, so I'm now going to raise the VAT registration threshold for businesses. And I thought, my goodness, he's going to do something radical. He's going to raise it to 150 grand.
No, it's to 90.
By 5 grand?
That's right.
Oh, and then he goes, and we're all being doubly taxed because we're paying income tax and national insurance. So, and I thought, my God, he's going to scrap national insurance. Oh, no.
Well, I don't think he's going to do bold measures. I mean, the way I've been on the inside, a lot of this will be driven by officials, let's face it. And the officials will be the people who will be there regardless of what happens in the general election. So...
Well, but then that brings me back, actually, to one of the People's panellists asking, I mean, is the officialdom, is the Treasury just acting against anyone that's Chancellor that wants to be doing something radical? The question was, do you think that the deep state acted to get rid of you?
So I'm not a deep state conspiracy theory guy. I mean, I'm a historian, so generally I believe in cock-up, not conspiracy.
Fair play.
But I think, you know, that doesn't mean that people weren't acting against what the government was trying to do. I don't think it was particularly coordinated. But there is resistance. There's often resistance to things that the government is proposing. But that's the job of the ministers, to bring people along with them. I mean, when I was Bay Secretary of State, I worked very well with officials because we had a clear set of purposes.
How about the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility in all this? Because obviously that body was set up to sort of act as a check and balance to a budget that might go slightly off the rails. To be fair, you didn't consult the OBR, and that might have been why your budget went off the rails.
Sure.
But are the OBR now sort of having far too much influence on the contents of the budget?
So I think they're a very powerful organisation. And the reason why they're more powerful now is that we tried to cut them out. Liz Truss and I tried to cut them out.
Why did you decide to do that?
I think the feeling was that we just wanted to get on with things. I think the Prime Minister was very keen to press her programme, and she knew that if she went through the OBR, a lot of the things she wanted to achieve would have been prevented, essentially.
Yeah, so there's an agreement that the OBR has become all too powerful.
It's very powerful. I mean, there's no question that
too powerful.
It really constrains what chancellors can do.
But are you saying too powerful?
I'm saying that I think it's got way too much force, and I can understand why chancellors and the civil service look to the OBR. But the other thing about the OBR is that its predictions are almost always wrong. And I was very clear when I said this to the Prime Minister at the time, that their 72 billion black hole that they predicted, I said by the new year that would close because inflation was high, and that meant fiscal drag would mean that taxes were going to go up, as is exactly what happened.
I mean,
so the black hole wasn't nearly as big as they suggested.
On fiscal drag, shouldn't he have unfrozen the thresholds? Because when we did all of our calculations for the Telegraph, you can put your earnings into a tool and find out if you're more well off or better off or less well off in 5 years' time. Everyone's less well off because of the freezing of the tax thresholds.
And that's where the OBR's numbers are really important, because if he were to lift the thresholds, according to the OBR's arithmetic, he'd have to raise money in other areas to make the thing balance. And that's why it's very difficult with the OBR to reduce taxes, because essentially they force you, if you're going to reduce taxes, they force you to either raise taxes elsewhere or borrow the money, which creates its own problems.
I mean, on another level, isn't it a good idea for them to have shot Labour's foxes when it came to, say, the scrapping of non-dom and some of the other measures?
Well, the problem with that, I mean, it sounds clever and it's triangulation, the sort of thing we saw 20 years ago. But a risk of that is that if you're essentially taking Labour policies, you're endorsing Labour.
Yeah.
And the electorate will say, well, you're doing Labour policies anyway, why don't we vote? Why don't we just vote for Labour?
Yeah.
That's
so do you
my
think they should have been a bit more reformish?
Well, look, I think, and actually Michael was here early, Michael Portillo, and he used to have a phrase, which I remember from back in the day, clear blue water. You want some distinction between what you're offering
and what the opposition is offering. If you're essentially doing a pale imitation of what they want to do, you're essentially endorsing their platform. And people will ask themselves, well, why don't we just vote for Labour?
Well, talk about clear blue water between Starmer and the Tories. Is the answer to that question to bring back Boris?
Look, I think I've said here on this show that Boris is arguably, well, no, not arguably, I think incontestably the best campaigner the party has. He's won more elections than anyone else in the party, certainly more than the current Prime Minister. And he'd be a great force for the party. But that's a question for the party leaders and for Boris. I'm not sure that Boris himself particularly...
I think last time you were here, you were sort of saying that Rishi needed to swallow his pride and give Boris a call because there'd been the suggestion from Boris's people that he would accept a call but not make a call. I've written yesterday in the Telegraph, which you may or may not have read.
I did read.
This piece about the Henley plot and the idea that he's installed a close friend, Caroline Newton, to be the parliamentary
Does she know about the plot?
Candidate. Well, I think she may be aware of it because she did comment on the possibility of a Boris comeback last year. So he needs to be elected, doesn't he, as an MP in order to do this? Could he lead the party again, do you think?
So I certainly think he could lead the party again after the election at some point.
Yeah.
I would never rule him out. People have done that all the time, and they've generally had egg on their face. But I think that for this election, it's very unlikely, firstly, that he'll be a candidate. And secondly, that I don't think he'll necessarily be that enthused about campaigning for people who he feels were the ones who got rid of him.
Do you see David Cameron as a competitor? Nobody's talking about Cameron. They're talking about Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch and
So a couple of things have to happen for David Cameron to get back. He has to essentially renounce his peerage, which he might do, and then get back into the Commons, and you'll have to find a seat. But, you know, if we look at the last 8 years, nothing is impossible. I mean, all sorts of things have happened.
So we could be facing some kind of Boris Cameron redux. Imagine. That will be like deja vu, honestly.
I'm not sure how likely that is, but anything is possible.
You had a reaction to the Tugendhat and Trevelyan intervention on defence spending. They've said to the Chancellor that they think that the Chancellor should have earmarked more money. What do you think of that?
I think it's very bizarre about that. I mean, I'm with everything Michael Portillo said, I agree with. We've got to get away from this idea that we just, you know, by spending money, everything's going to be solved. We've got to look at how the money is spent. I think that's really important. I was surprised to see ministers, serving government ministers, bound by collective responsibility, essentially freelance and write their own article.
Well, I mean, there's nothing new there, is there?
Well, no, that's pretty bold. I mean, you'd have to go back a long way to see something as blatant as that.
Do you think they're being disloyal to Rishi Sunak?
Well, you know, I've never heard of a situation where... I mean, backbenchers, that's fine. Backbenchers are not part of the government.
Yes.
But actual serving ministers saying...
I know, but maybe they're that
worried.
They're that worried about the threat from China, Russia and beyond.
No, that's fair enough. But generally, in the old days, you would voice those concerns behind closed doors.
Yeah.
You'd speak to the Chancellor.
But maybe they've spoken to the Chancellor and they're getting nowhere.
But the idea that you just write in the newspaper or on social media, I think is a new development.
Should we talk about Michael O'Leary's intervention, the Ryan Airbus, talking about Brexit, saying it was the dumbest effing idea in history, delivered by the dumbest politicians in history, Farage and Johnson, and basically saying we need to wait for the over-70s to die out, which is, quotes, a good thing, because younger people will change things.
I find that pretty extraordinary. I mean, as Michael said, Michael Portillo, I mean, a lot of his clients, his customers, are older people.
Yeah, it's a two-fingered salute to his own passengers.
He doesn't understand I mean, he's a businessman. He doesn't really understand about democracy or care about sovereignty or any of the issues, really, in Brexit. I mean, I understand where he's coming from a very narrow perspective. But actually, as Michael Portillo said, it's not just about his company. Brexit's a much wider question about sovereignty, about legal self-determination.
I mean, economically, you voted to leave. Lots of debate over whether Brexit has been economically calamitous, whether COVID's been more calamitous. I mean, what's your take on it?
So, look, the thing I don't understand is the fact that Germany and France are essentially in recession. Their economies they're not doing better than ours, they're doing worse, if anything, particularly Germany. So the idea that, and these are the two biggest economies by far in the EU, so the idea that if we'd stayed, we'd somehow be doing much better seems bizarre to me, given that the two biggest economies in the EU are doing worse than we are at the moment. I've never really understood that argument. I think there's a lot of sentiment, a lot of emotion, and I understand that. But practically, when you look at the German economy where it is now, and you look at the French economy, and you look at the Eurozone as a whole, it's not as if they're growing at 5% and we are where we are.
Yes.
They're basically doing the same or worse.
No.
So I don't understand how staying in it would have improved our performance.
Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Great analysis of the budget on Wednesday. Now, lots more to come in the next hour. I'm going to be speaking to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Victoria Atkins. Can the government really get the NHS waiting lists down? Don't go anywhere.
We have a ton of top prizes to be won in our spring giveaway. There's a massive £12,345 in tax-free cash to spend however you like, along with £500 in shopping vouchers for your favourite store, a games console, a pizza oven and a portable Sonos smart speaker. And the best news? You could be our next big winner, just like Phil.
Whoever wins it next is going to be as happy as I was, and they're going to get even more money this time round, so why wouldn't you go in the draw?
For your chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text prize to 84902. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Is a debate on gender really a far-right issue?
Far right. I'm so bored of that phrase, you know what I mean? Like, anyone who talks about... anyone who acknowledges that there are two sexes is suddenly far right, because that's what Hitler and Mussolini were all about. This question from Shirley is, of course, about Labour. They've been accused of being undemocratic because they pressured a pub into cancelling a debate, and this debate features Kelly J. Keane, who's been on this show a couple of times, and she's a campaigner, and she was just on the panel, and then they got a letter saying that they couldn't do it because Kelly J. Keane apparently attracts far-right groups. Now, they've tried this trick before, but because some awful, ghastly neo-Nazi types turned up near to an event that she was holding in Australia, they kind of tried to blame that on her and suggest that the two were the same thing. They weren't. That was an opportunistic group turning up to... They're not... Neo-Nazis aren't pro-feminist. They're not pro an event called Let Women Speak. That's just ridiculous.
New Zealand's TV blurred her touching her zip because they said that her touching her zip was a far-right dog whistle because she's making that symbol.
Yeah, but she wasn't making the symbol, she was just adjusting a zip.
Yeah, and also, this isn't a far-right symbol.
I mean, that was incredible because she obviously wasn't making that symbol anyway. She was just adjusting a top. But this New Zealand news channel blurred out the hand so that they could pretend that it was some horrible ghastly... Yeah. I mean, this is stuff, isn't it?
She's talked about having voted Labour in the past. She's so not far right.
But also, even if she were right-wing, which she isn't, why would they be banning a panel where there's a discussion about one of the most important issues of our day? What are Labour playing at here?
They're anti-democratic, aren't they? They're just kind of playing whack-a-mole with things they don't like. I think maybe I'll write to the pub and say I do want to see Kelly J. Keane there.
Yeah, but they won't listen to you
well,
if you
no,
say that, will they?
Won't.
Because you've got the unfashionable opinion, Chris.
Well, and the unfashionable workplace.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Still lots more to come. In just a minute, I'm going to be joined by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Victoria Atkins. The NHS has once again received a cash injection from the Treasury, but can it be reformed to be more value for money? In an exclusive first interview since his return to Parliament after a 4-year investigation against him was dropped by the Met Police, I'm going to be joined by the Conservative MP for Romford, Andrew Rossendale. He's had quite an ordeal, so stay tuned for that. Lord John Mann, the government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism, will be reacting to the idea that London has become a no-go zone for Jews because of the pro-Palestinian marches. And Stanley Johnson will be here to talk about his latest adventure following in the footsteps of Marco Polo. And of course, I will be asking him what he makes of a recent documentary looking at the rise and fall of Boris Johnson. But first, let's now welcome into the studio Andrew Rossendale. He's been through quite an ordeal because he's been the subject of a 4-year police investigation into allegations against him. He's just returned to Parliament and those claims and those allegations have been dropped. So he's now resuming his role fully throated for the Conservative MP for Romford. Lovely to see you this morning, Andrew. Look, I know you haven't really spoken about this to anyone, so I'm grateful for your candour this morning. The The complaint was first received in 2020. You were then arrested in May 2022 on suspicion of indecent assault, sexual assault, rape, abusive position of trust and misconduct in public office. You then were the subject of this investigation, which has only now been dropped in 2024. So this dark cloud hanging over you for 4 years, only to end up having no action taken against you whatsoever. I know only under arrest, never actually charged. What's that been like?
First of all, can I say I'm pleased to be back on GB News, and I'm pleased to be back doing my role fully as a Member of Parliament. I was elected to do a job. My concern is that anybody in public life can now be accused of something and be simply knocked out, removed from doing the job that they were elected to do. Any MP could now be a target. And I think that something has to change because we have an election coming up. But apart from that, constitutionally, how is it right that an elected Member of Parliament cannot be in Parliament to do their job in full? So it's not a nice thing to go through, but I am determined to ensure that in future other MPs are not subjected to the same thing that I've had to go through. MPs need protection. We need protection in so many ways.
Yes.
You know, we're abused online, the vile things that are said on social media. We are also under threat of violence.
Yes.
I've lost two very close friends through violence who are members of Parliament. One was murdered by terrorism and another was murdered at his surgery, Sir David Amis, by a fanatic. With so many risks now for members of Parliament. And I say to you, Camilla, I say to the British people, do you want MPs to be able to do a job and to represent the people in a democratic way? If we're going to live in fear of false allegations, of potential violence and perpetual abuse on social media, it's not really a good advert for encouraging people to stand for Parliament. So something has to change.
For legal and other reasons, we're not going to go into the details of this entire ordeal that you've suffered for 4 years. Suffice to say that you do, of course, support the idea of MPs being investigated if complaints are made against them. And that's only right, isn't it? We know that some MPs have been found guilty of wrongdoing, and it's absolutely correct that they should face the long arm of the law. At the same time, I think you're concerned about the manner in which MPs are investigated if complaints are made. It's often a they said, you said type situation. And as you say, you're then completely removed from the parliamentary scene. You don't really know what's going on with the investigation. A degree of opaqueness in the process is also a problem, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the worst thing, lots of bad things about all of this, but the worst thing, I think, is that if you're representing a constituency and people have voted for you because they have confidence in you to vote on their behalf, if you're suddenly not there doing that job, constituents are rightly concerned that the person they have confidence in and elected to do a job is not there doing it. And so how can it be right that any MP should not be able to vote on legislation, speak on matters that are important to their constituents? Because you just need one person. You just need one person to make an accusation in a malicious way, and that will knock an MP out. That can't be right. There has to be a change to the system.
Then what's the, I mean, if the system's changed, what are you going to be calling for? Anonymity for those who are accused of wrongdoing?
Camilla, I believe that everyone in this country should be innocent until proven guilty. That's the foundation of our laws and our justice system. And I'm worried that now the process becomes the punishment, that a process can go on and on and on for years, potentially, at great expense to the person who's being accused, because they have to obviously engage lawyers and legal advice and all the rest of it.
I mean, has it cost you a lot financially as well as personally?
You can imagine. I don't want to make this about me. I want to make this about ensuring that we have a fair system going forward and that no Member of Parliament, no public figure has to go through the same kind of process again. There needs to be a way of doing this, which, of course, you're right. If someone has committed a crime, whether they're an MP or an ordinary member of the public, whoever they are, that has to be investigated. But there has to be a way of doing it which takes into account, particularly if you're an elected parliamentarian. Just imagine before an election if a number of potential candidates or MPs are accused just before an election, and that knocks them out of being able to stand.
Well, that also raises the sort of suggestion that perhaps MPs are being targeted. Just before I move on to that question about the sort of personal cost for you, financially, has this cost you a lot of money? You've obviously had to take legal action, consult lawyers over the course of 4 years. Must have cost a fortune.
Inevitably, you know how much lawyers cost. But look, it has to be done, and you have to bear that cost. At the end of the day, what matters is that you get people to represent you when you're in that kind of situation. But how have you borne it? Have you had to eat into savings? Have you had to remortgage houses? That's a matter for me to resolve. But yes, of course. But you're significantly out of pocket because of all this. Of course you are, because you cannot engage top lawyers to deal with a situation without having to pay for it. Yeah. And I think that most people would not be able to even consider employing lawyers. They'd have to rely on the legal aid, which is minuscule, and you don't get the kind of service that you would need. So I feel for people. I feel for all people that are falsely accused. I feel for all people that are arrested just on a malicious accusation. And I think that we need to sort the system out, because otherwise it's not justice. But are you saying that you think MPs are more uniquely at threat from malicious allegations? I mean, I suppose they could be fuelled by political ideology. It could be fuelled by the idea that actually MPs don't naturally garner much sympathy with the public. You know, politicians, their reputations are up there with estate agents and indeed journalists, right? So therefore, if you're accused, the impetus very much is sort of to say, oh, well, he must be wrong, and, you know, and you then have to disappear. I say to people watching this brilliant programme, and by the way, throughout that period I was watching you every Sunday. Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping me going during that period. But the reality is that the public need to just pause. When they hear of an accusation or allegation, when they hear something bad about a Member of Parliament, they should pause, check the facts, just see if there's any validity to it. I look at social media, not just to people write about myself, but other MPs, the vile, horrible, wicked things that are said. I mean, most people, how can they cope when you're being abused in that way? We have to have a thick skin. I've developed a thick skin over the years. But we all do. But the public should realise that we're all human beings, and that to say nasty things and to make up stories or to exaggerate some small rumour which turns out to be untrue, the hurt that causes, and other people, I think, wouldn't be able to cope with it. I mean, I got through it because I knew from day one that you know, it was all unfair and malicious, but other people, I think, would have a great difficulty getting through it. So the public should be careful about what they say. I mean, you say you've developed a thick skin. Tell us about the personal cost of all this, because you must have had pretty low moments during the course of the last 4 years. I've got wonderful friends and family and people that were there for me. My constituents were wonderful all the way through. I carried on working throughout. I carried on doing all my work in the constituency and being available for people, attending events. And that kept me going, really, because I knew that at the end of the day, you know, things do happen in life which are not good, and you just have to fight back and carry on. I believe very much in the keep calm and carry on philosophy, and that's what I did throughout. But it just took too long. It must have taken its toll. I mean, how were you during this period? Well, I was actually more concerned about the people around me. I think my staff had to cope. You know, they were incredibly loyal. They stayed with me and supported me throughout. But I couldn't go and see them. I couldn't go to the office to do daily work. So they had to come and meet me in coffee shops and things of that kind, or come to Romford, my constituency. And yes, people around me were distraught and upset because it affected their lives as well. It affected all my former staff. It affected all the people that I work with in a broad spectrum of areas. As an MP, I'm involved in so many different things. But pretty much everyone stuck by me and said, look, we don't believe this, and we know you, and we support you, and we want you back. And that kept me going. At no point did I feel so low that I was about to throw in the towel. I just wanted to get it over, but it shouldn't have taken as long as it did. I mean, for it to take 4 years... Right, so this isn't quite right. It wasn't 4 years, it was 21 months. OK. From arrest to exoneration? Yes, I don't know what happened before that, but certainly from that 21-month period. Yeah, that's long enough. It's long enough, but I kept busy. You know, I did all my emails, I did all my constituency work, I went to events. I carried on as normal, but looking forward to the day when this would be over.
But did you feel that there was some feet dragging going on? I mean, that is an extraordinary period of time to find out that allegations are malicious.
I don't know. I'd like to thank the Metropolitan Police for everything they did. I know that they would have done everything possible to expedite the inquiry. I had no doubt from the word go that it was going to be fair and that they were going to do it properly, and they did. I thank them for that. But from their point of view as well, not only from the point of view of an accused person, there's got to be a quicker way of dealing with this.
Yes.
21 months is too long.
Maybe the pendulum might have swung too far in favour of believing the complainant. I can understand why the authorities and indeed the Met and police forces have to take complaints seriously. Of course they do, because if people are claiming to be the victims of wrongdoing and indeed of actual crimes, it must be thoroughly investigated. But perhaps since the so-called Pestminster scandal, the pendulum has swung too far in the favour of complainants against the MPs who are accused.
I think that there has to be some serious evidence before a very long inquiry is started, and I think that's where they need to be. They need to make sure, not just MPs, but in all cases. Look, the police are stretched. There's so many things going on they need to deal with. What they don't need is to go on a wild goose chase with lots of inquiries because of malicious, particularly politically motivated accusations. So there has to be a better process in terms of the way the police handle it from day one to ensure that they're not spending time on dealing with things that are vexatious rather than actually dealing with real crime that's going on in our country today.
You say you were lucky enough to have the support of the good people of Romford and indeed parliamentary colleagues. I wondered, has the Prime Minister got back in touch with you since you've returned to Parliament?
Well, I've got in touch with him. I've had 2 questions at PMQ.
But he hasn't got in contact with you.
I haven't spoken to him personally. I haven't spoken to him personally.
Is that a bit disappointing from Rishi Sunak?
It'd be nice to hear from him. He can text me if he wishes. But look, I put 2 questions to him in the chamber and he answered, and he's promised to come to Romford.
All right.
I made him promise that in the chamber and he said he's going to do it, so let's hold him to that.
Well, I know you don't want to be defined by this incident because you've been a politician for a long time, and I know you've got some very strong beliefs and policy ideas, so let's get into the politics of the matter now. Your majority there in Romford is 17,893, so you should be all right. You're confident of re-election because obviously we've seen what the Tories are doing in the polls. You can't have missed that over the last 21 months, the sort of rapid decline of Tory support in this country. What's your reaction to that?
Yes, well, I've obviously watched all kinds of incredible things happen in the last 2 years, different prime ministers coming and going, and the sad passing of Her Majesty the Queen. And you know, I miss some of the events that I would have loved to have been there for. You know, the lying in state of Her Majesty, I'd love to have been there for that, and, you know, to see the coronation. But look, there's lots to be done in our country, and I'm motivated by love of country. I love this country. I want this country to succeed. We've made a lot of mistakes. My party's made mistakes. But the Labour Party, I think, would make far worse mistakes
But then,
than
do you think the budget was a mistake? We learned today from the Sunday Telegraph that half of the public doesn't think it's going to make a difference to them. You will have heard me speaking to Kwasi there about it being a Labour-light budget, and therefore there's only a fag paper really now between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Is the solution, Andrew, you know what I'm going to ask you, to bring back Boris?
Look, I spoke in the budget debate the other day. I want to get back to proper Conservative vision for the country, which means small state, low taxes, get the state out of people's lives, and the budget needed to reflect that more, and I said that. Hopefully there'll be an autumn statement later in the year when they can do rather more than they managed to do this time. I don't think that it's realistic to bring Boris back at the moment. He's not a member of Parliament. I think. But
should he be brought back to campaign?
I don't think he should have gone in the first place. But by the way, I supported him. I don't think he should have been pushed out of office. I supported him. My constituents voted for him. He had an 80-seat majority, the biggest majority of any Prime Minister on the Conservative side since Margaret Thatcher. And yet he was turfed out of office. I disagreed with that.
People say not unjustifiably, Partygate, you know, misleading Parliament, general disorganisation, better at campaigning, less good at governing. Having said all that, he's a proven campaigner, isn't he? There should be a reaching out from Downing Street to Boris Johnson just to campaign, because, as you've said, this budget hasn't moved the dial for Hunt and Sunak, has it?
Boris Johnson is a huge asset to the Conservative Party, and I'd love to see him back in some kind of role. Clearly, he's not a member of Parliament at the moment, so he couldn't become leader of the party, but it would be great news for the Conservative Party if he were to come back and help us win the election.
Has the government failed the public on immigration, do you think, Andrew? I know you have got very strong opinions about particularly the Australian points-based system. We've now got the OBR baking into the budget a forecast for immigration to be around 300,000 per year. That's too high, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I'm afraid we have failed the country on immigration, but all parties have done so. Margaret Thatcher was very strong on immigration, and she knew that it was important to control immigration. I think, really, at the time of Mr Blair taking office, everything seemed to have been loosened up.
I know, but we can't blame it all on Blair still, can we? I mean, 745,000 in last year, so much for the tens of thousand pledge. You say successive
Camilla,
governments. It's 14 years of Tory rule. Then.
Unsustainable. It cannot go on at the levels it's at the moment, and I've made that clear that we need to be true to what we've said at every election to control immigration. We haven't done so. The public out there demand that we do so. If it carries on the way it is, we're talking about colossal additional people coming into our country. It's unsustainable, so our government needs to take action to do that. I have no confidence that the Labour Party will. The only party that will have any hope of controlling immigration will be the Conservative Party.
Being a Brexiteer and a righty and somebody who talks about small state and low tax and indeed about lower immigration, you would be a perfect candidate, wouldn't you, for a crossing of the floor to reform. Have you been tapped up by Farage or Tice? Because they're boasting of speaking to many Conservatives, and I just think you might fit that mould. What's your reaction to that?
No, I have not been approached, and nor would I join any other party other than the Conservative Party. So you can forget that.
Fair enough.
I'm not going to make an announcement on there. But I did see Anne Widdecombe the other evening, who's a personal friend of mine, with Lady Amos, actually. We went to Southend and we had a lovely catch-up. And I agree with a lot of what reforms stand for. But, look, if the right is divided, the winner will be the Labour Party, and that will be a catastrophe. So I do say to people thinking about voting reform, if you vote Conservative, you may not be happy with us on everything. Yes, we have let you down on certain areas, but the last thing we want is a massive majority for Keir Starmer. That would be a catastrophe for Britain.
I know, but you can't blame Conservatives because you're one of them for being completely disenfranchised from what appears to be a very centrist administration, a non-Tory Tory party at the moment, led by a couple of people who wouldn't look out of place in New Labour.
If you come to Romford, Camilla, and you're welcome to come any time, you'll find that constituents of mine will say exactly that. On the doorstep, they're not happy. They voted for a party they thought were going to do a lot of things, and we haven't managed to achieve all of those things. We did get Brexit done. Brexit was finalised. That was put through at the start of Boris's term. But they are disappointed on immigration, on high levels of tax and on various other things. So we need to get back to core Conservative principles again.
Right. Andrew Rossendale, thank you very much for telling us your story this morning.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see you back in Parliament and back in the studio. Well, thank you very much to Andrew. In just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Victoria Atkins. Is the NHS fit for purpose? And when are the Tories going to come up with a plan for social care? Stay tuned.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now, I'm sure you have seen this video that went viral this week, and if you haven't, well, I think you're going to enjoy it. This is a firefighter leaning on a fence whilst watching a trapped driving instructor's car sink in 4 feet of floodwater. Looks very comfortable there, doesn't he? Just leaning against the fence.
Just chilling, just relaxing. There were there were in fact 2 Essex fire and rescue crews, an ambulance and a police car parked near the sinking vehicle, but they wouldn't enter the water because they had to wait for specialist crews who were trained for the water depth.
Well, 2 people who weren't going to sit back and watch were these 2, Jack and Danielle Price, who took it upon themselves to rescue the submerged driver. And Danielle joins us now. Very good morning to you, Danielle, and you are a hero, an absolute hero. What happened in this video? Make sense of it for us.
So we were filming in the area for our YouTube channel, and we've seen the fire brigade come through. I was actually out at 5 o'clock in the morning with my husband, Jamie. We know it always happens there, as you can see, and it was clear. We've seen the fire brigade come through, we've followed them, and they're just standing around as if nothing's happened. In the clip, it says he's fine, he's on his phone, and then sort of walked away. But what they failed to realise is when my partner actually opened the door, as you can hear, he's on the phone to the the emergency crew in panic, thinking he's going to sink. So we could not just sit there and watch. He's absolutely terrified.
Yeah, poor bloke. Well done you. Do you reckon this is health and safety gone mad?
It is, because although I do sympathise with them, they are so red-taped, but surely sort of common sense has to kick in as open the door.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debate, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Now, I was hoping to speak to the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins. She appears to have gone AWOL, so I'm going to bring Andrew Rossendale back into the conversation. I'm going to speak to Victoria Atkins, I hope, about the NHS. You'll have noted in the budget yet more spending for the health service. No spending, I noted, as I'm sure you did, on defence. Is this idea of pouring yet more money into the NHS, I think it's an extra $5 billion for a digitisation project, going to help win votes on the doorstep?
Camilla, I'm never going to criticise money that's spent on healthcare because it's important to the British people. I do worry that we keep shoveling money into public services and it's going into a big black hole.
Yeah.
I don't know where it's going. And what I want to see is an efficiently run National Health Service. So throwing money at something isn't the simple answer to the problem. The problem is also running an organisation that actually delivers. And I do fear that every government promises more and more and more money for the health service, and yet we don't really always see the benefits of that. So it's also about organisation and management and spending money efficiently, and that's not what we've seen very much of.
I mean, I feel that the government has missed a trick, particularly when it comes to pensioners, because, of course, the Tories have long been promising this social care plan. I'd imagine the pensioners in Romford are in desperate need of some clarity about adult social care. If they go into care homes, do they need to sell their homes? We had that talk, didn't we, after the Dilnot reforms of a cap on social care. Is that something that voters talk to you a lot about?
Very much so, yes.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that people are afraid of most about what will happen in their latter years, and owning their own homes and wanting to leave their property, as they rightly should, to their children, and then finding they can't do so because it's all going in paying for social care. No government has got a grip of this problem, and it is a serious issue that needs to be addressed.
Now, in terms of sort of London and Greater London, we've talked earlier about the idea of perhaps the Tories facing some kind of electoral wipeout. It does look as if London is going to be lost by the Blues. Do you have faith in the Tory candidate Susan Hall to beat Sadiq Khan? Because there's a contradiction here, isn't there? The London mayor has never been more unpopular. Obviously, schemes like ULEZ, low traffic neighbourhoods and other sort of net zero motivated policies have proved really unpopular with people in the capital. We've then got the issue of the pro-Palestinian marches and how they're making Jews feel in London. And yet, I don't think Susan Hall at the moment is looking like she can topple the London mayor, do you?
I hope Susan does. I think she's a great candidate. I think she's a genuine person. She's come up from the grassroots as a councillor in Harrow, and I think that she deserves support. And don't write her off, because if you remember last time, Sean Bailey was way behind, but in the closing days of the election, he actually got a lot closer than people expected. What I can tell you, Camilla, is in Romford, people are voting for her massively.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we now are joined by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Victoria Atkins, the MP for Louth and Horncastle.
Hello.
Lovely to see you this morning, Minister. Thank you for joining me.
Lovely to see you too.
We've been talking this morning, I've had Kwasi Kwarteng in the studio and others, talking about whether the budget was a bit too Labour-light. According to the Sunday Telegraph, half the public don't think it will make any difference to their finances. It's not a ringing endorsement of what the Chancellor announced on Wednesday, is it?
Well, look, this is a budget that delivered a tax cut, the second consecutive tax cut over the last two fiscal events for 29 million people who are working. That is a significant tax cut for them. We know that for the average worker on some £35,400, they will see an overall tax cut of £900. For my nurses, my hospital porters, my receptionists and many others who work in the NHS, that will be a very significant addition to their pay packets. But we've also managed to achieve through this budget not just that tax cut, we've also been able to help 500,000 families with child benefit. We know there have been difficulties at the very top end of the threshold for child benefit. 500,000 families are about to see benefits of up to £1,200 from those changes. And in addition to that, the Chancellor was able to protect day-to-day spending for my department, for the NHS, but importantly also to prepare the NHS for the future with our £3.4 billion productivity package, which is really great news. This plan is going to really help prepare the NHS for the future.
Health Secretary, I can understand why you're happy with the budget, because obviously you did get that extra funding for healthcare. There is an argument, however, to say, you know, how long does the government go on pouring money into the NHS if it needs to be reformed and it needs to be more value for money and it needs to cut waste?
Well, Camilla, you and I are as one on that, in that we know we're spending record amounts on the NHS. We have more doctors and nurses than ever before. That is fantastic news. But we also know that in the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, the productivity rate of the NHS was higher than it is today. Now, look, we had a very difficult time during the pandemic, and it is taking time to recover from the pandemic, which is why, for example, we have fully funded recovery plans for emergency services, for elective operations and so on, and for primary care. But we want to go further. And this productivity plan, that is fully funded, by the way, means that we will be using technology and AI to not only improve the working lives of doctors and nurses, so they're spending more time with patients than they are with paperwork, but also critically using state-of-the-art scanners and other technology to make sure that when patients go in for their diagnoses, they are getting the best and the quickest service they possibly can.
Patients do need to get in for those diagnoses, don't they?
And fairer.
OK, but patients actually have to get through the door, and they're a waiting list now. They're approaching 8 million. People will rightly be asking themselves, how does this money, how does the digitisation project get the waiting list down? So tell us unequivocally, when will the waiting list come down, and how much will they come down by, say, by the end of next year?
So we have already seen, the last 3 months, we have seen waiting lists decrease. And that is despite industrial action. So a huge amount of energy. Between, well, November to January, it's about 150, 160,000. We've got the cumulative figures. It is the start of what I want to see, our recovery across these plans.
It's a drop in the ocean, isn't it, compared to 8 million?
Well, yeah, and you are right, absolutely, we are absolutely right to focus on this. We have had industrial action. We know that's had an impact. So, for example, for the 12 months from December last year, we saw some 1.4 million appointments cancelled. There will be listeners and viewers at home watching this who have had their own appointments cancelled. But despite that, we've been able to make some progress. I am determined that we go further than this, and this is why the investment that we heard at the budget is so significant, because not only will we keep the foot on the accelerator when it comes to electives, to those waiting lists, but also I want to help clinicians spend more time looking at patients, as I say, than looking at computer screens. We know from looking around the world, some of these computer systems, they can help free up to a quarter of a clinician's time in a single appointment. And that's how we're going to improve productivity.
The NHS has problems in the past with computer system rollouts, but nevertheless, one of our people People's panellist was asking how you stop the exodus of good doctors and nurses to the likes of Australia, Canada and New Zealand. I mean, you've got the junior doctors and others calling for higher wages. That's what's going to stop them, isn't it? Otherwise, if they feel they're better off in other countries and indeed they're under less pressure, they're going to move away.
Well, actually, we have more doctors and more nurses today than we have ever had. To put that into context, we've something like 250 more doctors each month and something like 400 nurses each month for every month we have been in power since 2010. But you are right to say, to challenge me on, you know, what are we doing both to recruit but also to retain doctors and nurses? And this is why this week I was really pleased that I've been able to find a settlement with consultants, which they're putting to their members. I hope their consultants will feel able to support it, that will help ensure that we bring an end to industrial action for consultants. With junior doctors, I have said to them, I want to do a deal. You know, they have already had a pay increase of up to 10.3% this year, but I want to do a deal. It is a great shame, I think, that they walked away from those negotiations last year. But if they come back to the table with reasonable expectations, I want to do a deal. And what is more, I'm not just looking at pay. I want to act on some of the concerns I've heard from not just doctors but nurses and other people working in the NHS about their working conditions. You know, I think the NHS cares for us and the NHS should also care for its staff. And so I'm determined not just to look at pay but also to look at working conditions as well.
Just a final question, Health Secretary, on anti-Semitism in healthcare. I know you've been investigating one particular doctor who was suspended from the medical register for a litany of anti-Semitic, racist and sexist messages. But then he may be back in his post, this Dr. Pasaridakis. He may be back in his post in 3 months' time. Should doctors who are being anti-Semitic, racist and sexist ever get their jobs back?
So I hope you'll understand, Camilla, I can't comment on individual cases, but what I can tell your audience is that some months ago I wrote to both NHS England and to the regulators across healthcare to underline our expectation that their members and staff working in the NHS will adhere to the values of the NHS, and that any incidents of language or views that do not sit in accordance with those views, that they will be challenged and dealt with by, oh, forgive me, I'm going to fly without my earpiece, that they will be dealt with appropriately and accordingly. And I do, you know, everybody in the NHS, everybody in the regulators I know wants to ensure that those standards are maintained.
Okay.
I'm really sorry I've lost my earpiece, so I'm just going to have to assume that I can
I can see the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, has lost her earpiece, but thank you very much to her for joining us this morning. Coming up next, amid reports that London has become a no-go zone for Jews on weekends, I'll be speaking to the government's anti-Semitism czar, Lord John Mann. Is Rishi Sunak doing enough to combat extremism in the UK? Stay tuned.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Welcome back to Headliners. And Paul, we're going to get straight into Monday's mail for some good old-fashioned, traditional male breastfeeding.
Yeah. To answer the question, what is the latest woke hell, Josh? Row as hospitals say hormone-filled milk from trans women who were born male is just as good for a baby as the real thing. It's possible for men, if they pump themselves full of estrogen, to grow larger breast tissue, and they often do. If
or you just eat lots of burgers.
Exhibit A. And once you've done that, it is actually then possible to express or lactate a liquid. Okay. If to that liquid you then add another load of pills, medication, chemicals, whatever, that lactation juice can be fed to a baby.
We don't really... This is not for the sake of the baby. The baby has no benefits from this whatsoever. The studies are very weak on it. It's a bit worrying because, you know, when hospitals started indulging in homeopathy and having, you know, the NHS had homeopathic hospitals, that was worrying because they're supposed to be a trusted authority. And before saying something like this, there should be an awful lot of study done.
I want to shame this hospital. This is
whether it's necessary.
University Hospital Sussex NHS Foundation Trust. That's who it is. And they have written one of the stupidest sentences I have read aloud in the 2 years that I've been privileged to do this show. It says, the term human milk is meant to be neutral and not gender biased.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Yep.
Oh, my God, we're laughing at you.
I mean, and as someone says here, babies are not props. And that's the scary thing. And when we're not focusing primarily on the health of a baby.
No, but the feeling of a person doing it rather than it's a bit of an odd way to go, isn't it? So.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. Let's get back to Reading now. Catherine Forster's with the People's Panel. I tried to get a few of their questions in there, Catherine. I hope they recognise that. But what's the verdict from Reading?
Yes, thank you very much, Camilla. We did hear that. I'm going to ask Charles, first of all, because I think you asked two of his questions, both to Kwasi Kwarteng and Victoria Atkins. Charles, first of all, what did you make about what that former Chancellor had to say about the current Chancellor's budget, first of all, and then also his response to your question?
I don't think he was too in praise of the present budget. And as we said earlier on, it's sweets today, but it's best if we all go out and get to know a good dentist, because we're going to need him further down the line, I think.
And also, your question about Liz Truss's comments about the deep state were put to Kwasi Kwarteng. What did you think of his response?
His response was neither here or there, actually. He didn't deny it, but he didn't consent to it either. He gave a typical politician's answer, but I think there's definitely something was going on in the background all the time.
A typical politician's answer. We do get a few of those, unfortunately. John, I'll come to you next, because we're talking a lot about health, the fact that we're spending more and more, we seem to get less and less. You worked as a management consultant within the NHS. What did you think of what the current Health Secretary had to say? And also, what do you think the solutions are for the NHS's very big problems?
Yeah, I think she basically repeated the initiatives, the extra funding, but I didn't detect anything strategic in her responses. I haven't detected anything about a strategy to fix the fundamental structural problems in the NHS, the long-term trends of population growth, greater complexity, ageing profile of the population. There's no strategy there. It's all itsy-bitsy bits of money here, an initiative there, but there is no holistic approach and there's no strategic approach to solving the biggest problem we have in the public sector, and that is the black hole of the NHS.
Thank you for that. You've all been Conservative voters. Fair to say you're all pretty disaffected with them as things stand, as are many people. Nicola, if I could ask you, there was a bit of chat, wasn't there, about Boris Johnson, some speculation that he might stand and come back. What do you think about that? He used to be your MP, didn't he?
He was, and I would say he was a very good local MP, and I had such high hopes when he became Prime
Prime Minister. Having said that, I was very disappointed. He showed himself, he wasn't Churchillian when it came down to it. He was weak in the pandemic. He locked down on the advice of scientists without taking a broader view. And he's also been very heavy on net zero, and I consider him to be actually more of a Lib Dem than a Conservative, and I think many Conservative voters would feel the same way.
Yeah, interesting that many people think he's of the right, but in fact quite on the left of the party in many ways. So at the moment, of these three former Conservative voters, I'm afraid there's not a single one for the Conservatives as things stand. They've got a big mountain to climb ahead of the next election. Back to you, Camilla.
Great job in Reading, Catherine. Thank you very much. And thank you to the People's Panel. Don't forget, if you'd like to apply, it couldn't be easier. You just have to email peoplespanel@gbnews.uk. Now, I had planned to speak to Lord John Mann, the anti-Semitism czar, but unfortunately we're having trouble getting in contact with him. So I think let's say that we'll table that interview till next week if he's available. But don't worry, because up next, as promised, I will be speaking to Stanley Johnson to hear about his latest ventures and ask what he makes of reports of a Boris comeback. Don't go anywhere.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. It's going to be a cloudy day today. There'll be outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, and it's still a chilly feel for the time of year too. And looking at the picture for this morning, a lot of cloud across the UK, outbreaks of rain across many areas, just a bit of sunshine towards the southwest, and that remains so for the afternoon too, but this could trigger 1 or 2 showers as we move through into the evening time. Elsewhere, generally it stays cloudy for much of the day. Outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, and the wind's still coming in off the North Sea, so a chilly feel for many of us. Into the evening time, this rain will continue to push its way westward. Still a lot of low cloud behind it, some drizzle in places too. So a damp evening to come, and that takes us into Monday as well. It remains cloudy through Sunday night. Further outbreaks of light rain and drizzle in places, some low cloud leading to some foggy conditions over the higher ground, and temperatures again falling to around mid-single figures due to the cloud cover not falling too low at all. But it does mean another cloudy grey start to Monday. Outbreaks of rain and drizzle feeding in off the North Sea, particularly down these eastern areas, remaining quite damp for much of the day. Best of any brighter spells will be towards western coast, but even here it will remain largely cloudy through the day. Some showery rain for Northern Ireland too, and temperatures just about getting into double figures. See you soon.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. As promised, as billed, author, environmental campaigner, former MEP, father of Boris Johnson, Stanley Johnson, joins me now in the studio.
Father of quite a few others, actually.
Actually, father of a lot of children. A lot of very successful children, not just a former Prime Minister. That's a good point. I might ask you about your parenting skills later. However, first of all, let's talk about Marco Polo, the subject of your latest book.
I have been so lucky, so lucky. I set off in 1961 yes, over 60 years ago with Tim Severin and Michael Larrabidi on a motorcycle to try and get from Venice to China on a motorcycle. Well, we got right to the Chinese border, and 62 years later, with my son Max, we have had a chance to finish that journey off, and I did 8 weeks this summer. One Tribe TV, working together with Chinese CCTV, put a fantastic team in the field, and we went from mountain to mountain, from prairie to prairie. We went from the Himalayas.
We're seeing some footage now. It looks absolutely
We went from the Himalayas.
fabulous.
Oh, that's it.
Were you on the back of a motorbike, though, Stanley? That's what I want to know.
Well, we were. Not as our main means of transport, but I certainly got on motorcycle once or twice.
You and your son
that's
there.
where we are. We are coming down now from the Hypermeers towards Kashgar. That, by the way, that was the glacier. That's one of the biggest glaciers in China. It's a 7,000 footer, that mountain.
Wow.
7,000,
So for those listening on the radio,
meters.
by the way, we're looking at footage now, Stanley and his son Max, and they're kind of going through
look, that's me on a
Silk
yak.
Road.
That is me mounted on a yak. And actually, it's a yak race. You could say it's a wacky yak.
Yacked. I mean, of all of the things you've achieved in your career so far, Stanley, I think yak racing is probably up there. Why should we care about Marco Polo?
Because he was fantastic. He was a man who set off from Venice with his uncle and his father, and he set off in 1271. It took him 4 years to reach China, and he...
4 years?
4 years. 4 years. Well, he spent 1 year, for example, in Gansu at a town called Zhangye, which we also went to, and there's the biggest lying butter in the world in Zhangye. He spent 4 years, but he was able to take advantage of the peace and prosperity, which was, would you believe it, wrought by the Mongol Empire, the Mongol rule.
Yes.
You had Genghis Khan. Marco Polo had to pay homage when he got to Beijing to Kublai Khan.
Yes.
Kublai Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson. So, yes, it's very strange. For me, it was a historical revelation to realise.
I know, I love that you're calling this work, by the way. I mean, it looks absolutely fantastic.
Well, it was fantastic, but I have tell you something. I have written a very serious book. It is 70,000 words. First, it's the first part, then it's the second part, as you might say. And here we are in the desert. That's some dancing going on. And it's going to be called In the Footsteps of Marco Polo, and it'll come out actually at the same time, I hope, as the film of this series, which, as I said,
film as well.
is 4.
What number book is this, Stanley? Because I know you've written dozens.
You know, I'm afraid this is my 26th
26?
book. There were 13 novels, 13 fact books, and 2 volumes of autobiography.
Can we talk about China? Or China, as Donald Trump likes to describe it. Do you think I mean, I know you're a Sinophile. I know this about you. And therefore, do you think that we demonise China a bit too much in the West?
Well, I have been following China fairly closely, not as closely as people like Isabel Hilton, obviously. But I was actually part of the first EU delegation to go to China in 1975, August 1975. Mao was still in power. I think 10 or 15 of us went representing, in a sort of informal way, the EU. And I learned a lot then. And I've been going back ever since. 3 of my novels have actually had a Chinese base.
Yes.
One was even called Dragon River, about how they built a huge dam called...
So are we mishandling our relationship with China?
No.
I mean, we've obviously got concerns about Taiwan being invaded.
Look, I'm a bit of a fan of the Osborne-Cameron golden era of Chinese relations. I'd like to see President Xi back in that pub in Chequers.
Really? What, with everything going on with Chinese spying and infiltration of Parliament?
We've got well, all I can say is I live by what I could see, and we had 8 weeks moving from place to place, being fairly unscripted, I've got to say. And I came out, but from my point of view, you very kindly introduced me as an environmentalist, and I looked at this. Every hilltop we saw had a wind turbine on it. The solar panels, every desert had solar panels. Imagine you're a country like China.
I know, but China hasn't got the best record when it comes to fossil fuels, Stanley. I mean, we can't be holding it up as a beacon.
I will hold it up as a beacon.
What, even though it's building ever more power stations?
Well, what it is doing is really galloping down the renewable energies front. I mean, the other day, the Secretary General of the United Nations said we needed 11 terawatts.
Doesn't China account for, like, the majority of global carbon emissions?
No, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't.
It
is a big emitter, as the EU is and as the United States is.
I'm glad you mentioned the EU. Should we talk about the EU and talk about the fact that obviously Keir Starmer is advocating a closer relationship with the EU? I know you love the EU. Therefore, would you be tempted to vote Labour at the next general election?
Nothing would tempt me to vote Labour. What would tempt me is a coherent policy now to rebuild bridges with Europe. I mean, it seems to me absolutely absurd that we are setting ourselves up, having come out, to say, oh, well, now we must more and more separate ourselves out.
Because,
now,
as somebody close to you once said, leave means leave.
Well...
Is that not a point?
Marco Polo built bridges between East and West. I'm now in a bridge building mode, and I would like to see, for example, I think, do you know something? I think I would vote for any political party which at this point said, I want to bring Europe, UK, back into the European Environment Agency. We were always there.
OK, well, therefore, you're voting for Starmer, then?
Well, no, he's not said that.
Well, he's almost said that.
No, he has not said that. He needs to say that. Because
if he said that, would you vote for him? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I might well. I tell you something, I might.
GB News exclusive alert, I might vote for Labour.
What is more important?
Says Stanley Johnson.
Tell you something, what is more important in the end? A political party or some absolutely massively important topic, which is the environment, which pins down what you can do for generations to come, and I would say that's more important. I would buy into any. By the way, if I go back to the, let's say, the 2015 Tory manifesto, which had a lot of good stuff, and I think my son Joe was pretty heavily involved in writing the 2015 manifesto. I'll vote for anybody.
Did you not like the 2019 manifesto? Somebody you know as well as Joe, I think, was involved in writing that.
Well, I think Boris, if you're actually mentioning Boris, were you mentioning Boris?
I was mentioning Boris. Funny you should mention Boris. He's the subject again of some speculation in this morning's papers.
I saw it. Something like 20,000 words by Camilla.
Yes, that's right.
Tominey.
I did write a long piece yesterday about whether
I read it.
Boris should be brought back to Henley. What do you think?
Well, you actually slipped into the fact that Henley already had a candidate.
I know, but it has a candidate that's very close to Boris Johnson, and I thought that was significant.
You'd have to be pretty close to say, yeah, I've actually been selected as the Tory party in candidate, and now I'm not going to say as well deselect. Although I noticed today you were running a piece about de-arresting people.
Oh, so maybe deselecting is a thing. Voluntary deselection. But to be serious for a moment, presumably you've had conversations with your son, of whom you're extremely proud, and therefore...
And whom I am well pleased.
Indeed so. And so if there was a call from Rishi Sunak for him to go back to campaign, and indeed he had a Cincinnatus-style sort of inkling that he wants to come back, would you... I mean, is that credible? Would you support
I noticed your Cincinnatus reference in that piece.
Well, he made
Cincinnatus actually came back. I don't think the fate which greeted Cincinnatus on his return was totally to be emulated. No, do you know something? I think I would take a pretty tough line. And if my eldest son were to say to me, look, Dad, I'm thinking of, starting again off in politics. Would you support me? I say, look, I'm going to make a pretty tough bargain here, Boris. In terms of my support, I'm only going to support you coming back into the political fray if you start really pushing again on the environmental stuff, which you push very hard on, and if you really say, look, I may have been responsible for Brexit, but now my job is to rebuild that bridge. So those are two pretty firm bids I'd make before I voted again.
Well, it sounds like you're going to be saying to him, you'll have to do this, otherwise I might vote for Keir Starmer.
Well, I think he'd have to take this very seriously. I think he would have to take the threat of parental disapproval.
I'm not sure if I want to be around the Johnson dinner table for that debate, but do you concur with people who say, Stanley, that he could prove to be the saviour of the Tory party, a Tory party on its knees right now?
Well, again, I'm going to say I would make a conditional on this one. I don't think the Tory party is going to be saved by a move to the right. The Tory party is going to be saved by someone who says, look, we were going well, it was steady as you go.
But then Boris isn't on the right, so he could be the saviour of the centre.
Well, I'm on for that. I'm absolutely on for that. For example, you take plastics.
Yes.
Plastics, a world issue, a fantastically important issue. I mean, I happen to believe that we ought to be making a lot of fuss about plastics.
So if he makes fuss about plastics, then you'll vote for him if he were a future Tory leader and not Keir Starmer. I think we've nailed down that, at least today, Stanley. We look forward to your book and indeed your film on Marco Polo. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. And for joining in a little bit of joshing, which is charitable of you. Thank you. Well, that's it from me for today. Don't forget, I'm going to be back next week at 9:30 as ever. Don't forget you can catch up on my show at 6 p.m. if you haven't caught all of it today. And don't forget that Michael Portillo is up next from 11. Have a great day and happy Mother's Day to everyone celebrating.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. It's going to be a cloudy day today. There'll be outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, and it's still a chilly feel for the time of year too. And looking at the picture for this morning, a lot of cloud across the UK, outbreaks of rain across many areas, just a bit of sunshine towards the southwest, and that remains so for the afternoon too, but this could trigger 1 or 2 showers as we move through into the evening time. Elsewhere, generally it stays cloudy for much of the day. Outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, and the wind's still coming in off the North Sea, so a chilly feel for many of us. Into the evening time, this rain will continue to push its way westward. Still a lot of low cloud behind it, some drizzle in places too. So a damp evening to come, and that takes us into Monday as well. It remains cloudy through Sunday night. Further outbreaks of light rain and drizzle in places, some low cloud leading to some foggy conditions over the higher ground, and temperatures again falling to around mid-single figures due to the cloud cover not falling too low at all. But it does mean another cloudy grey start to Monday. Outbreaks of rain and drizzle feeding in off the North Sea, particularly down these eastern areas, remaining quite damp for much of the day. Best of any brighter spells will be towards western coast, but even here it will remain largely cloudy through the day. Some showery rain for Northern Ireland too, and temperatures just about getting into double figures. See you soon.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We're springing into spring and giving you the chance to win the seasonal essentials. First, there's an incredible £12,345 in tax-free cash to be won, plus a spring shopping spree with £500 in shopping vouchers to spend in the store of your choice. And finally, a garden gadget package to enjoy, including a handheld games console, a portable smart speaker and a pizza oven. For your chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will